Hallelujah. Come on, let's worship him. It's time to seek God in a very solemn way. Hallelujah. And you know the enemy comes to make you afraid. He'll make you fear to take that step in God. But how many are willing to take that step tonight? Regardless of the cost, regardless of the circumstance, we want you to know tonight that no weapon formed against you. Look at somebody and say, no weapon formed
Hello,
against you.
I am Joe Harrison, and I am presenting the civil rights movement in the Black church today. W.E.B. Du Bois and his analysis of the Black church wanted the church to become a transformative powerhouse of social, racial, and economic uplift. He believed that ministers were essential to this uplift because they possessed the power to instill moral fiber and encourage moral virtue. Also, the Black church is not disconnected from the historical and future struggles of African people from the diaspora, but a part of it. We African people have always had to defend ourselves against our enemies and fight for our collective sovereignty. For example, Queen Candace is best known for fighting and winning favorable terms from Augustus Caesar following the conflict known as the Meroitic War in 22 BC between Kush, which is now Sudan, and Rome. Queen Nzinga, the monarch of the Mbundu people in what's now Angola, was a resilient leader who fought against the Portuguese and their expanding slave trade in Central Africa in the 16th century. Yanga of Veracruz, Mexico, led a revolt against slavery in 1570. Zumbi was a Brazilian leader who was one of the pioneers of resistance to slavery of Africans by the Portuguese in colonial Brazil. The community of Palmeiras was established in 1605 by 40 people from Central Africa who fled to the heavily forested hills that parallel the northern coast of Brazil. The Stoner Rebellion in South Carolina developed on Sunday, September 9th. In 1739. It was part of the British colony even before the United States was created and was shaken by a slave uprising that culminated with the death of 60 people, led by an Angolan named Jimmy. A band of 20 Africans organized a rebellion on the banks of the Stono River in South Carolina. The Haitian Revolution was a successful insurrection by self-liberated Africans against French colonial rule in Saint Dominique, now the sovereign state of Haiti. The revolt began on August 22nd, 1791, and ended in 1804 with the former colony's independence. Nat Turner was an African American who led the rebellion in Southampton County, Virginia, on August 21st, 1831, that resulted in the 60 white deaths. The Deacons for Defense and Justice is an armed African American self-defense group founded in November 1964. During the Civil Rights era in the United States, in the mill towns of Jonesboro, Louisiana, they were threatened both by white vigilantes and witnessed discriminatory treatment by police under Jim Crow laws. The Bogalusa, Louisiana chapter gained national attention during the summer of 1965 in its violent struggles with the Ku Klux Klan. This by no means are all the battles and uprisings that African people have performed throughout history. The Black church and the civil rights movement. The Black church was not just the spiritual home to Africans in America, but out of the Black church came businesses and educational institutions. It also gave its members a sense of value and belonging. The civil rights movement was meant to restore the rights of African American people who lost those rights after the adoption of the Jim Crow laws from the late 1800s to the mid-1900s. It is one of the most influential social movements in the 20th century. The Black church played a pioneering role in the civil rights movement in the United States in the 1950s and 1960s. The Black church not only provided support to various civil rights organizations, but also acted as the movement church itself. The church ministers played a vital role in the success of the civil rights movement, and the Black church mobilized resources and made the civil rights movement possible. Also, young African Americans were at the forefront of this historical movement. Children that attended Sunday school at church were also participating in marches and advocating for equality amidst severe racial violence across the nation. The black church also became targets of thugs and terrorists during the Civil Rights Movement. For instance, the historic Emmanuel Methodist African Episcopal Church in Birmingham, Alabama, was bombed by the Ku Klux Klan on September 25, 1963. And as a result, 4 young girls at the peak of the Civil Rights Movement were killed. Since the black church is said to have played a seminal role in the Civil Rights Movement, the intolerant section of the white community, which could not reconcile themselves with the gains of the black community springing up from the Civil Rights Movement, still target black churches today. One of the latest incidents of such an attack on the black church took place in Charleston, South Carolina, in which 9 black worshipers were killed by a white gunman on June 17, 2015. Black churches have not only been at the epicenter of African American life, but also acted as an important institution that not only nourished the Civil Rights Movement, but also led it from behind in a variety of ways. It is true that several organizations like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, played a more important role and a direct role in the 1960s, but the black church had always been there, not only as the umbrella of the organization, but also as the mother organization that always influenced the Civil Rights Movement by giving every kind of support conceivable and essential for the overall success of the Civil Rights Movement. One cannot overemphasize the role of the SCLC as the preeminent organization and the charismatic leader of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as the central figure leading the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. But it can plausibly be argued that neither the SCLC nor Dr. King could be thought of without considering the pioneering role of the black church. The black church provided resources, an institutionalized financial base through which protests were financed and meeting places where the masses planned tactics and strategies and collectively committed themselves to the struggle. People provided the church with resources because they owed alliances to the church, which funneled those material resources to the social movement organizations like the NAACP and the SCLC. Thousands of dollars were raised by a number of churches in a short time to finance various activities. This type of fundraising for any action related to the Civil Rights Movement by the churches not only demonstrated the financial clout of the churches, but also their role as the financiers of the movement for equality of black people. The Civil Rights Movement developed the creed as well as the philosophy of nonviolent resistance, and the black church had an important role in its articulation prior to its grand articulation by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. himself. The church provided the prayers that spoke directly to the needs of an oppressed people. Many black churches preach that oppression is sinful and God sanctions protests aimed at eradicating social evils. The teaching of the church connected the purpose of the movement to the spiritual teachings of Christianity, with which most black people were familiar as a way of life and as a symbol of their culture. According to Andrew Young, a civil rights leader, Dr. King echoed the message of the black church and the civil rights movement. He said that nobody could ever argue that segregation and integration had nothing to do with black people. But when Martin Luther King Jr. talked about slaves leaving Egypt and wandering into the promised land, it made sense to folks. It is true that people might have not understood it because it was not a political theory, but it was people's grassroots ideology. It was their faith. It was the thing that they had been nurtured on. And when they heard the language, they responded. Andrew Young thought that it was a natural backdrop when people were really united with the real meaning of that cultural heritage, and they saw their faith also as a liberation struggle that they could all identify with. Sometimes the church worked as venues of shelter for movement activists involved in various types of protest activities because the churches were the only organization capable of providing shelter in such moments of necessity. In fact, when the Freedom Riders were faced with hostilities and violent counteractions of the racist elements in white society in the Deep South in the early 1960s, it was black churches often came to help and gave shelter to the Freedom Riders. For example, when the Freedom Riders were attacked and beaten in Montgomery, Alabama, by the white mob, church leaders like Reverend Abernathy not only rescued them, but also gave them shelter in his First Baptist Church. And Reverend Abernathy justified that, saying it was fitting for demonstrators to be pinned up in his church. Culturally, Africans in America had to be more communal, not only because it is a part of their African heritage, but also because it was a matter of their survival because of the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow laws. Here in Philadelphia, there are two ministers that also stand out as leaders in the civil rights movement. One is Reverend Leon Sullivan, who also worked with our own Reverend Roman from Canaan Baptist Church. Reverend Sullivan was not only a notable civil rights leader, but an advocate for workforce development and skills training. The longtime pastor of North Philadelphia Zion Baptist Church also founded Philadelphia's OIC, or Opportunities Industrial Center. OIC offered job training and placement and other services for almost 60 years. Under Reverend Sullivan's leadership, Zion Baptist Church built the first black-owned shopping center. It was founded in 1968, and I was actually there with my mother and my Aunt Hazel, Mother Frances, at the grand opening of that mall, 1968. And it was funded by Zion Baptist Church charter members, the local Philadelphia black community, and individual investors. We also had the Reverend Paul Washington here in Philadelphia on 18th and Diamond at the Church of the Advocate. Reverend Paul rose to national prominence as an unwavering activist in the cause of civil and women's rights. One of the few black priests in a traditionally white church, he fought for tolerance and respect among all people, eventually serving 25 years as the rector of the Church of the Advocate in North Philadelphia. As a supporter of the Black Power movement and the Black Panthers, he provided his church as a meeting place for these and other groups working towards equality and justice. The Church of the Advocate hosted the Black Power Convention in 1968, a gathering that drew the leading black activists of the time. In 1970, he opened the doors of his church to the National Convention of the Black Panther Party, courting much criticism. Washington became accustomed to the criticism he received for his controversial beliefs, including his demand that Episcopalians pay reparations to the descendants of African American slaves. From 1964 to 1971, he served on Philadelphia's Human Rights Relations Commission. In conclusion, history tells us that we must prepare for the battles of the future by controlling the present. The Civil Rights Movement was a battle that past generations waged so today's generations could receive the benefits. The Black church must continue to wage the battle today to secure the survival of future generations. The struggle indeed continues. Thank you very much.